And we are going live. So, we back with another episode today. Gilded Sages, me, the Black Anglo Saxon, and my housemates, Inquisitive Q and Quan the Poet, are in the building today. And we here to just have another conversation. This time we are talking about the digital divide today, fellas. School started this week. I'm a parent. It was tough this week, but it made me want to have a conversation about, I think, a topic that everybody in the nation is struggling with, whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're Asian, whether you're whatever you are. I think everybody right now, up and down the economic stratosphere, you know are trying to grapple with and deal with how to manage, how to navigate the deficiencies that we have in our digital infrastructure here in America, as well as, as you get more and more to the bottom, those impacts becoming more and more devastating as we touch communities, like whether we're talking about African Americans or Latinos, who may not necessarily have the resources to go out and get a school nanny or something along those lines. Yeah. But we'll get into that later in our general conversation, which we'll also have people can call in, take this and go to the calendar and post that so we can have people call in later. But before we get started, we're going to start on the infrastructure. Today, again, to start the conversation, we're going to talk about infrastructure. Oh, before I get started, like the video if you're watching, share the video if you're watching. We need people to see, we need people to have a conversation. None of this works without you all. So please, if you are thinking about like how to help, that's a free way to just go ahead and help everything that we're doing. And it means a lot to us. It means a lot to myself in terms of helping us get the word out and everything that we're doing. But back to what I was saying, we are talking about today the digital divide. First up, we're talking about the actual infrastructure issues and the deficiencies and some of the trade deals that we saw earlier in the year propose and pose some issues for Americans abroad, especially in the Red Sea. And what I'm gonna do is I'm going to share my screen with you all. Yeah, what I'm gonna do with for you is I'm gonna share this really quickly so that like we always do, I'm gonna share my screen. So give me 1 second, beautiful people. And your article is, we are going to hit today. Bloomberg is first up, baby boy. All right. And if y'all can see that, give a thumbs up, hit a say a yes in the chat. So this is wireless providers serving rural America have a Huawei problem, right? And so I took my own out of it, but I definitely want to hear your perspective on it. And what I got from it was, while Huawei products are, already barred from dedicated government and military networks, officials say security hazards are also created by its equipment's presence in private networks near armed forces bases. They argue the gear on local networks could intercept signals from coming from a base and allow Huawei and the Chinese government to track the personal cell phones of military personnel and their family members. So can you speak to that first? Then, give me your take in terms of what you took from it. And then I would love to go into like a conversation about like TikTok and all of how that thing's kind of intertwined, because I heard they had some of the similar responses.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the things we get into when we start talking about geopolitical politics affecting our day to day is that when you begin to understand the importance of diplomacy, you begin to understand the importance of diplomacy. And then you look at the Trump administration international policy, and you see that it's very American first, it's very exceptionalism, So when you make a protectionist stance for American telecom companies to participate in the market by deeming Huawei, who at this point in time is seen as a leader in the 5G department, deemed an enemy to America, you see how the geopolitical affects the business and how that really doesn't help the end user.
Okay. And so when you talk about like the end users and geopolitical, can you help the audience and myself understand in terms of the geopolitical nature of what's happening and how it's affecting us in America as it pertains to what we're dealing with right now in COVID and how it exacerbates that?
I'm glad you brought up COVID, because COVID is a great example of how you have a national pandemic, or natural and national and international. But anyway, how you have a natural occurrence that disrupts or delays global supply chain. So that means that products take longer to move to market.
So, for example, the iPad that I just got is on back order because of
So what happens is, because you have it on back order, when you don't have something that's natural, when you have something that is a dance, like diplomacy, basically interpersonal relationships. We can see that Xi Jinping and Trump do not have a great interpersonal relationship. But what we have to understand is that interpersonal relationship reflects the ideology, or supposedly reflects the ideology in the thinking of whole nations. In the case of Xi Jinping, the Communist Party, Republic of China, in the case of the Trump administration, currently how Americans are supposed to view each other. So what happens is that because these two, it's like dad and dad is beefing with each other, so they're not paying the cable bill so that we can't have internet. We can't have internet because dad doesn't want to accept that dad has more money than dad, or dad has they're having a beef with each other. And so because they're having a beef, we have no Wi-Fi.
Got you.
We don't have Wi-Fi, we can't do our homework.
So what you're saying is this issue right here that we're talking about in terms of Huawei, in terms of rural service providers not being able to grapple with the demand based on the fact that these trade relations abroad have affected our ability and access to the bandwidth or the technology as it pertains to us being able to digitally move forward in a seamless manner.
Exactly. And so that's a great way for the tee off with the part I took in. If you can go back to the article for me, please, if you screen it. It goes, is among 60 or more telecom operators.
Go ahead. I got you.
Okay. 60 or more telecom operators swept up in a directive by the Federal Communications Commissions, or the FCC, to remove components produced by Huawei, which the U.S. government alleges could be spying on behalf of Beijing and U.S. officials. And so what happens is, because, again, revisiting, 60 companies are behind Huawei technology, which goes back into our schools, but I'll table that discussion in favor of saying, because 60 companies are behind Huawei's technology at the price point in which rural America can afford, you have the digital divide in which we're getting to about in inner cities, but we have to also begin to understand that America, geographically speaking, as well as business zones and sectors, is not homogenous. America has our economy, our national economy is made up of bits and pieces of different economies and different regions at different places. And when you get into the rural area or the Red Sea, you can see that they don't have the same benefit of having a population density that justifies taxes or tax levels that allows for people to say, okay, I understand why I'm paying for this public service. But then you also have internet service providers, and I think this was also covered in Hassan. I can't think of the show right now.
Mehdi Hassan?
Yeah.
And the Patriot?
No, not Hedy. Yeah, the Petty Triad. That's not Hedy Masonda.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hedy Masonda, I think, is in the Intercept. He's BBC.
Got you.
I love Hedy. He's hilarious. He gets on people. But you get what I'm saying.
Apologies.
You can see But you just get to this map. When you look at that map, you have these dead zones, and we have to also remember in the rural America, you don't have just white population or poor white populations as with West Virginia. You also have Latino, Latinx, or however they're doing it. I don't know the proper way. Mm-hmm. I need to get on that. You have those populations, but we also have Native American populations that people will say that they care about. So when we start talking about infrastructure projects, we have to look at, okay, in the digital divide, yes, we see the digital redlining in inner cities, but when the digital divide extends beyond our inner cities and our coast, and it becomes a policy in which you support, not just because it benefits children, but also because it benefits inner city Black kids. It also benefits a whole generation of Americans, and so that's where I stand with Huawei in America and not necessarily getting along. America and telecoms also failing and dropping the ball to deliver telecommunications, so that in this pandemic in which we're all kind of locked in and forced to rely on a digital infrastructure, that many are missing out on that advantage, all because of. Sorry, I'm on my soapbox. I'm getting off my soapbox now.
No, it's all good. I think it's necessary. And can you hand me the iPad? I think it's necessary, just the iPad. I think it's necessary to have that conversation, because when you talk about that, they always say, in terms of how we move in America, when you talk about African Americans ourselves, when you juxtapose that to other communities, usually, and when I looked at the report earlier, which we'll get into and which we'll post in the description box, it did speak to the Native American numbers. It spoke to the Latinx, Latino numbers, and they were all pretty abysmal. So in that
abysmal in what sense?
Abysmal in the sense of access, abysmal in the sense of even with that access, have how to navigate the technology. Because I saw also, speaking to that point, there was an article that had came out about some kids who had got the Chromebooks. Shout out to the schools and whatnot for trying to provide as much as they had. Because my son has a Chromebook, but fortunately for us, we have Wi-Fi, at the house. But these kids, though, had to sit outside of a Taco Bell to use their Wi-Fi, to be able to, even with the hardware that was given to them, had to go and reshuffle and basically find a place to actually be able to gain access to the internet. And so with that being said, though, what I want to do, because the iPad is, I want to stay super, super in lockstep. And so I want to talk about how, with this next article from The Hill, is race and the digital divide, and getting down into how these communities, even though we suffer as a whole, how that gap widens, or how much of a degree, or to the degree of in which people are suffering in terms of not being able to have access, being able to, say, go to a family member's house if you have like the stability within a certain community.
Social capital.
Social capital. And we always talk about social capital over here, because social capital is one of those things that I don't think gets enough looks when it comes to assessing a lot of these socioeconomic problems that we have. And so I think a lot of it gets missed, and a lot of the solutions that people propose fall short, because I don't think that they're, like you always say, balanced, in the sense that they're bringing in the different components that don't just always tie into, well, do you have the hardware or do you have the dollar? It's like, yeah, you have the dollar, but where does that plug into?
Understanding is missing.
And so with that being said, next up, we're going to have an article from The Hill, which is going to go into the racial divide in terms of when we talk about the digital age, and Give me 1 second, and then here we go. Boom. So you are looking at right now the Hill article, Race in the Digital Divide, why broadband access is more than an urban versus rural issue. What we were talking about just now, right? And it falling over both, but why it's more than that. And so its third wave study shows that as a county's African Americans population rises, broadband availability drops significantly. This disturbing trend is especially apparent in rural areas. To your point, across the country, nearly 75% of rural counties where most of the residents are white, have broadband available to them. But average broadband availability is almost 20% lower, just 56% in rural counties where a majority of residents are African American. In fact, rural communities that are majority African American tend to have fewer provider options, going back to your point in terms of that Huawei and how and helping you all link in how all of this fits. Um, Fewer service providers and are more likely to be completely unserved. The first district of North Carolina, home to more than 733,000 residents in the northeastern part of the state, is no exception to this troubling pattern. The lack of access to broadband is especially detrimental for those communities suffering from job disparities and the need of economic resurgence. In North Carolina, there are 10 persistent poverty counties, and of those, the first district contains seven. And so I'll start and then I'll get your comment and rebuttal in terms of how you feel about the numbers. And we'll drop the actual study, which is a pretty decent study, into the comments onto the Dropbox of the video. So, when I read that and I look at that, it brings me to or back to the point of that we're always talking about in terms of that economic floor that just isn't there, especially for African American communities. I can't speak for Latino communities in the same way because I do in terms of the social capital that they have available, but in terms of when we talking about African American communities, as we both know, if most people don't necessarily have a family member that they can borrow, say, a computer, an iPad, or come over and let's say use the Wi-Fi that somebody has access to. And so, what was reiterated and what brought back up to the front in terms of us being able to access not just programming through policy, but actually carve outs in terms of how much we are getting in terms of specifics as it relates to the programming or to the actual resources. Because again, a lot of programs, the schools, and I have no beef with the schools because the schools are doing what they're supposed to in terms of providing the Chromebooks and whatnot. But there's another article that we'll get into later, talks about, again, having to go that step further when you're talking about underserved communities or communities that don't necessarily, like we were talking about earlier. Again, you may be in a home with your Chromebook and all of the amenities, but if you are in a particularly toxic situation or a situation where you don't necessarily have that encouragement or that mentor within your home, you lose a whole subset of tools at your disposal. And I like for myself as an example, I'm not a teacher, right? I now have to take on a role of being able to sit my son down, keep him focused as a 5 year old on the actual laptop and just watching this box with his teacher speaking, being able to follow up with those things and then make sure that he's meeting marks. And that takes not only myself, but a different level of communication for schools that I have not seen in the past, especially when we juxtapose it to how we grew up, as students in DCPS. Because I can't speak for any other school district but DCPS. As my son is in DCPS, and that's what I grew up in is DCPS. But you can speak to that.
I'll begin with DCPS, right? We both went to Terrell. I remember crying going to Miss Trout class. Everybody cried going to Miss Trout.
She used to do that all thing.
Because her expectations were, show me. Like, when we got basic, you were crying. You didn't say if you got a basic. It was all proficient in advance. And so what I'm getting into with that, though, is that we're seeing how important teachers' job is to the socialization of the community. Because the school building itself facilitates the space in which because I'm in enough education spaces, you kind of understand 16 and 16, affluent or not, 16 and 16. Just being affluent gives you more access to do stupid things that 16-year-olds do. That's the only thing affluence really give you. It doesn't give you an emotional development that's more advanced than someone who grows up in poverty. If anything, someone who grows up in poverty understands if they can survive the trauma, understands what life is about and surviving. That goes into, if you have both of those students in the same school at the same time, they can kind of butt heads with each other because peer-to-peer learning is a very important aspect of learning. But with you being a parent, you have to see how important it is for teachers to socialize your child amongst other children that come from a community in which you don't have people in which they can go across the street and go, hey, can I borrow your Wi-Fi? Or, hey, my mom and dad are having a problem. So going back to what I always talk about social capital, what we're seeing with this digital divide is the value of a neighbor. The value of a neighbor as a teacher and as an educator. The value of a neighbor who, I may not be a teacher, I may not be an educator, I may not be a coach, but I'm a business person. Because I'm a business person, I have access to all of these amenities. So let's say that you're in a community in which you have a small business, localism. They have going to Taco Bell. Instead of having to go to Taco Bell, you can go to your local coffee shop, or you can go to your local baker. So we have to begin to see what value are we getting from national and international corporations when it comes down to, are you really a corporate citizen when my education system is so starved that kids got to go to a Taco Bell to get Wi-Fi? Or the system is so starved that in rural America, 700, I remember the statistic, like 700 plus thousand Black Americans that didn't, in rural America, didn't have the same level of access as white Americans. And that goes even into to show the inequities.
And that's in one spot.
24
million total.
24 million. It goes to show the inequities and the legacies of Jim Crow and how capital, although symbolically in the spirit of the law, capital has, quote unquote, caught up with our moral conscience. We can see in the market that capital has not caught up with our moral conscience. And a lot of these things are symbolic victories and not actual victories when it counts.
Yeah, and you brought up Jim Crow, which is a great point in having a conversation about how race enters each and every single discussion within America, whether people want to acknowledge it or not, or whether people want to discuss it or not. Because what you're talking about is an accumulation of deficiencies that have been bred within communities over time, and this lack of access. And again, the 24 million is from the Hill article in terms of Americans across the country of low income who can afford it and cannot. Like who they may have the access spotty in terms of being able to go on a cell phone, but in terms of being able to access it at different levels, because I know people like to talk about, or they brung up like everybody can be the next Steve Jobs, or everybody can be, and it's like they talk about coding is the new thing. And what people I don't think understand is when we talk about keeping it on a historic notion of how America has kind of created this situation. we have to talk about, like you said, the access that comes with that level of affluence. When we talk about what is a Steve Jobs, who did he have? An attorney as a father, an ecosystem. He had those type of things when he was a 7, 8 year old boy. So you're talking about a person who generationally, over the course of their life, have been interacting with something. Whereas again, when we talk about coming up in America, if you are African American, you would get shot if you would have just tried to read any kind of book, let alone you talking about getting a Mac in that day and time. And the reason that I bring that up and make that juxtaposition, because I know those two things kind of don't on the surface meld, but because I think what people don't do is understand how that stigma, or not stigma, but that rule of not being able to do certain things and your life being at stake, when certain things did come available, there's a drop not only in the access, but in terms of the desire to access it also changes and takes a hit.
No, I did that because I'm so happy. He doesn't know that he just so gladly teed up for me to do this. Shameless plug. When our website is built, the second white people, social capital, this is what this addresses. It addresses the legal history of African Americans. And what we have to understand in America is that capitalism is also tied to law.
Yes.
So, in the spirit of the law, African Americans are protected by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. In the letter of the law, those amendments are exploited. And so I get what you're saying, and that's when I talk about the morals. Like, the morals of America has not matched its efforts. The morals of America doesn't, and Dr. Kenneth Clark talks about this in an interview about moral schizophrenia in America, because it makes sense. And it makes sense when you're in a 19th century frame of thinking that, well, we don't have to kind of care about these goddamn people because they darkies. They dark. And I know I jest here, but Sambo art is real.
Yes.
Sambo art is very real.
Still real.
Dapper Dan literally got a job because of Sambo art. Come on, son. So it's like, we don't give a damn about these goddamn moon crickets.
And we'll
who cares about these schools? And that's what's happening with the digital divide. Who cares if they have access?
And to your point, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the Sambo art and how everything is interwoven with the legal infrastructure of America. And that goes to, I saw something the other day about a lady from GW. I don't know her name.
I know what you're talking about. The second Rachel Dozell. I love it.
Yeah.
Passing in America. Oh, I was so
what
happy.
Happens is when you look at that situation, what people have to understand, and when we talk about a digital divide, you may be talking about a person who's had access, but this is the con game that I want to get African Americans to understand, because I have no ill will towards the woman. I think it's beautiful. And the reason that I say that it's beautiful is because I think us as African Americans give too much leeway to people when it comes to identity politics. And when I say that, I need us to understand that when you start throwing around black cards and who can come to the cookout and all of those different things, you have to understand we're talking about a country where passing works on both sides. So you're talking about a person who can access the social capital of America through whatever other lineage that she is, but then come in to GW, a predominantly white, historic, very, very prestigious institution, right here.
In the Beltway.
Right here.
That we don't get.
You take that, use the policy in your favor, use the policy of quote unquote blacking it up or blackity black to then catapult yourself, because now you get the economic surplus that comes with, like we were saying, in terms of those carve outs being super specific, because this is where I'm telling people to divest from black, because black is killing us. The identity is a falsehood. You will not ever be able to maneuver blackness in the way that you want to gain momentum, because it is a manifestation and the creation of white supremacy. So when you are identifying yourself as black, I know people are going to hate me for that. You are identifying within a racist construct. You have to let that go. And I bring that up because a lot of people are mad. A lot of people were mad about the Rachel Dolezal situation, but again, we leave that door open. We were talking about coalition building a few minutes ago, and that's what happens when you build coalitions ineffectively. You allow people to come in and circumvent everything that you have been able to build, because that's not even. She could have also gotten minority benefits off of just being a woman, or if she was a non-black POC.
So what you're saying is, she's like the she's like the blackface Elizabeth Warren claiming Native American. Like,
yeah,
okay,
exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. Because Elizabeth Warren didn't catch enough flack for that either.
So what you're saying is that it's the problem isn't being a minority. The problem is a minority wanting their own shit.
Yes,
that's what I'm hearing. It sounds like it's like, why come. Be our slaves. No. Please, be our slaves. You are our most wonderful, cherished luxury item. I own another person. Luxury. But the moment you decide that you don't want to be that, and I bring that up because you also have Dr. Kenneth Clark talking about that in the Dark Ghetto, and you also have, isn't it the second white people? Anyway, going back to what you were saying.
No, I just wanted to touch on that before we moved on, because I thought it was an interesting point.
I love it.
And while we're talking about the digital divide, especially with their education,
I'm going off in my head because it's just like it's Toni Morrison and Blue Eye. And if you know Toni Morrison's work, you know that William Faulkner is a part of Toni Morrison. America does not want to talk about poverty. It doesn't want to have a conversation about poverty. Because it rather racialize poverty. It rather racialize it. Because once you understand, or as you were saying, divest yourself of blackness and you divest yourself of whiteness, as James Baldwin said in 1971 with Nikki Giovanni, or Dr. Nikki Giovanni at this point, once you become in America, you understand America, you don't become black, nor do you become white. You become something else. Not Dr. but Ken Burns and Skip talk about how much we're family. Once we really begin to talk about slavery as it was, and that the brutality of slavery, we'll begin to see that America is more of a family fight. It's like, ooh, that's an ugly.
I always call it that, because I call it the, and I like that analogy because it works when you get POCs who come into the fray, and we can move on after this because
that's fine.
POCs come into the fray, and they don't necessarily quite always understand the dynamics and what's going on, and why right now all of these racial tensions have been exacerbated in this election cycle, or how they are weaponized against the, like you said, poverty and labor itself, because I wouldn't say don't necessarily want to study America like that, but most people view, or most POCs that I've interacted with, view America as a very transit nation. Gotcha. So what happens is like, I'm not really trying to be here anyway, and I'm really just trying to get to the pot of money so that I can build up my own family. Because like you said, family, it's all a family fight.
Family fight.
They don't quite understand why. And this is why I'm always talking about, no, African Americans have to lead this. Like ADOS has to lead the actual conversation about America. And I need the allies to allow it to happen. Why? Because this is like you said, age-old fight. There's certain things and mechanics that a person just arriving maybe 30, 40 years ago may not necessarily understand, because these conversations are very old. Like what's happening right now in the Latino community, where you have Latinos being mad at other Latinos for siding with conservatism, quote unquote, the Republicans, and quote unquote assimilating and things like that. It's like you all are being pit against each other in the same way that every other immigrant group has. This is a part of the process, and this is how this is done to maintain the social hierarchy that is quote unquote whiteness, because people will choose. But with that being said, you got any last words, my brother?
No, that was perfect.
Okay. So now we are going to go from the hill all the way back to our one of our faves. This is the Atlantic. And so right now we're just going to have a general kind of conversation, general kind of discussion about,
I'm sorry. Your face is just teeming with something. Do you have something to add?
Oh, no, not yet.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry.
So right now we're going to have a conversation, a general discussion from one of our favorites, The Atlantic. The article that I'm about to show you is what teachers need to make remote schooling work. And so this is just kind of a more general conversation about teaching and schooling and education during COVID, which is why I thought that was a perfect segue. And so what I'm about to do right now is bring this up to the screen so that everybody can see this. And this is from the Atlantic on teaching, what teachers need to make remote schooling work. Okay. So one of the things that I came across when I saw this was very interesting to me is that one, they laid out the article really, really nicely. And I'm gonna just go through it all so you can see how they did it. And so you see free high-speed internet for students, peer-to-peer professional development, the ability to bend the rules, emergency aid to low-income families. And so they kind of just blocked it out into every little segment that they quite need. But what I wanted to touch on was the free high-speed internet for students, as roping it back into the Huawei not having access and being in those type of trade relations where the pieces, the technology might not necessarily be as accessible on the hardware side, and then it also being a struggle as well on this high-speed internet service provider side, right? And so it says an estimated 12 million students, or nearly a fifth of all students in the U.S., don't have internet at home. A 2016 report on the digital divide found that a quarter of families below the median income level rely on cell phones for internet access, and that 20% of the respondents with a home computer said that their internet had been disconnected at least once in a year. They were surveyed because they couldn't afford to pay for it. It says even if schools can provide their students with computers, the lack of good quality internet is disrupting classroom interactions for all students, like we mentioned earlier. And then it goes to talk about what some other people are doing, which I thought was pretty interesting. In some other places, public libraries are offering free Wi-Fi hotspots. One in the district, Tucson, Arizona, is creating Wi-Fi hotspots in school buses parked near low-income neighborhoods for families who are farther away from schools and libraries. I thought that was a pretty innovative way. So if you are an elected or you running for office, you can steal some of these ideas. Please feel free. I'm here to help y'all win, and all I need for you to do is hit me out. Because guess what?
I need to go that budget. I want to. I gotta have this kind of budget.
But DC, we'll get to it.
I got you.
Many teachers are already being trained to use virtual teaching tools, but different disciplines require different digital approaches. Teachers need specific instruction in how to effectively translate their subjects to online platforms. And lastly, some cash-strapped districts in cities like San Francisco and Philadelphia have already been channeling emergency resources to finance distance learning plans, but teachers see this as only one part of the much bigger task schools in the country more broadly will be facing in the coming months. I agree. Our district has been working tirelessly to help schools provide food, access to devices, and learning. McCamey, the Mission High School principal, told me. And so I'm gonna stop right there. And what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna just go on, and I'm gonna just say, for one, I loved the idea about the school buses when I saw that. But then I said, in DC, we use metro buses. But I believe, though, if I'm not mistaken, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat or one of you all, we do have Wi-Fi on the buses, and I believe that we were in the process of trying to get the Wi-Fi hotspots all throughout the city. So I think you go ahead.
But this is to a larger point, but I'm gonna let you finish.
No, I was just about to say, like, I think what happens is in this environment, I think what we see is a complete restructuring and collapse of the education system as we know it. Because I don't know how you feel, but I don't think we're going to be going back to a traditional learning system anytime soon. And even when we did, I think as a result of everything we have done now in terms of the accommodations that have been made, I don't think we'll ever get back to the traditional styles of learning. And I think what'll happen is people over the course of time will find themselves kind of finding doing blended styles more so as I think
Hybrids.
as I think it allows a lot of room for the teachers uh as well as the students because I think it is good in the sense for the older kids because if we weren't in the situation of COVID, it would allow for them to be able to do extracurriculars a lot easier, which I think are more beneficial to the development of people outside of just sitting in the classroom all day. But you can go ahead.
I can see that. To dovetail, I can see what you're saying because it does allow for less commuter traffic because you don't have school buses, you don't have parents driving kids to school, especially if you have parents who have an occupation that allows. Most likely, if a kid has Wi-Fi, it's because their parent has an income that allows them to have Wi-Fi. So you have a parent and a child at home, so they kind of taken care of to a certain degree, and they will kind of like that hybrid option. But when I start to think like a sovereign, because I think of all states and municipalities as a sovereign, when I start thinking as a sovereign, it's like, okay, so that kind of helps my problem with environmentalism too, because it helps me cut back on carbon emissions. But then it creates another problem when it comes down to pollution and social work, because we know the state knows people don't behave. And what I mean by that is that, ideally speaking, this is great. I mean, you got kids that can stay home. This could potentially help with pregnancy. This could potentially help with, and not necessarily saying that pregnant moms have to get back to work, but just to say that pregnant moms don't have to, or women who just had children do not have to put in the hard work of driving to work, to be able to support their families. They can kind of heal in place, but that also takes into consideration the mental. I'm just thinking physically at that time, and because I'm not a woman and I am a cis male, I like to hear women talk about that. But to your point, though, we have to see how women in the workforce see how this government works for them and how this works for them. We also have to see how cities, because that's when we talk about the Red Sea, the rural area versus the inner city, because in the inner city it's called the digital redlining. And with the digital redlining, I'm weird. We know I'm weird. I think of poverty as, it's mostly the way I grew up too. I see poverty as time and neglect.
It is.
It's really neglect. And so you can't maintain neglect or try to restore neglect. With that neglect, you demo it and you try something new. So in trying something new, we can see how population density in DC, we have inclusionary zoning. So you don't know, we're no longer going to have that big black flight and white flight that you saw with in the 60s, or I should say the 19, since the Great Migration in 1910 to 1970, in which you get a lot of the black immigrants because of post-colonialism in the 1960s. But that's another point. When the cities begin to redesign around the needs of people, because people migrated to cities because cities is where the economic hubs are. But now when you have the opportunity to have money and space, which the suburbs promise, but I can have money and land, which the rural area promise. It's going to be interesting to see how the digital divide changes the digital market landscape. Because one of the biggest things behind teaching, I go back to that, is a socialization. So now you have to, because Gen Z, and one of the biggest things in the research about Gen Z is like, how do they socialize? Because they have different social anxieties than we have. Because cyberbullying, like one of the things about cyberbullying that I don't like is that you can't punch a bully in the face. I don't advocate violence, but I do advocate you standing up for yourself.
Absolutely.
Don't tread on me. Don't tread on me. I'm sorry, that's an American spirit that I embody. Is like if you're going to try to psychologically aggress against me, I feel like I have a right to punch you in your face because you're trying to dominate me psychologically. I have no right. But when a person is anonymous and they can bully you and embarrass you digitally, there's a different thing that goes on. And that goes back when the digital divide is also going to highlight social inequities. Because people can get teased because my house don't look like your house.
Exactly. And I want to go back to something that you had mentioned prior to in terms of how mothers, parents overall in terms of the work schedules, you know, being a hurdle. Because for me, it's a hurdle in terms of I got to sit down and dedicate the first half of my morning now to my son, whereas I'm a person who's used to interacting with a bunch of people throughout the day. So it's like now it's my phone calls are cut down or my conference calls are cut down because I can't just be in the background. I have to be absolutely present or my son may suffer in the sense that he isn't necessarily grasping the information. So I think moving forward, especially when we talk about the disparities in income and the disparities in access to whether it be not only the technology, but the housing, brings into a larger conversation that I think is going to have to be had. I'm hoping that, you know, the quote unquote great savior Joe Biden drops it. I doubt it, but I don't want to even divvy it to him. I think it should be one of the talking points in our presidential debates. Somebody should bring it up because I think moving forward,
have a drinking party for that, James.
We should.
That'd be hilarious.
Yeah,
hey, would y'all show up for that? We should have a live drinking party for the debates
because it's going to be all entertainment.
It is going to be super entertaining. I don't necessarily know if I want to do audio. I think audio should click in and out. I'm more like on the type.
Hey, bro.
But that would be fun. Like a Gilded Sages.
Before I go to him,
that'd be funny.
That would be awesome because this is going to be pure pay-per-view. Because
border is acceptable.
Ignorant.
Yeah.
It's hell.
It's hilarious. You know what, watching Joe and what's his name?
Trump.
I can't even get his name. It's like watching Joe and Trump. It's like watching Boris and Sturgis talk to each other. I don't know if you know Nicola Sturgis. She's the SNP, the Scottish National Party.
No, I know Boris, but I don't know Sturgis.
Oh, Boris is the UK. Well, England, really. But anyway, Joe is kind of like Sturgis in the sense that he's kind of more approachable, but Sturgis is way more astute. So taking the astuteness out of Sturgis would just put this awkward presence there. That's Joe. And then Boris and Trump get along because they both think they'll be world kings. Like they think that monarchy is still a thing.
Monarchy is still kind of a thing. But before we go into that and we go too far, it's a thing.
People don't like it.
As an educator, I would love to hear what you have to say in terms of everything that we are talking about and the digital divide and your takes.
So for me, when I look at the digital divide, I think that a lot of people are just outright neglecting that the majority of what you learn in school is the socialization piece. Nobody remembers their first grade lecture on rudimentary math. They remember the conversations that was had with teachers, with resource staff, with office workers, like the janitors. All of these people matter in a lot of these schools. You go to some schools in Southeast, you got kids that'll listen to the janitor more than they would their teacher. Like these are all people that contributed to the education for everyone. And it's like when you cut out these people from the actual education process, you are missing so much of what is needed in for the child, because the parent cannot provide what the behavior tech can provide, the school psychologist can provide, the office workers could provide. There's some people that honestly learn more from the office resource person than they did in their classroom because of the relationships.
So let me ask you this. Do you think that given how we talked about America has a tendency to divest from lower income communities when it comes to education, do you think that not being in those environments and not having access to what most people would call shoddy resources is better, or for better or worse in terms of having maybe access to a school resource officer, but that school resource officer also has biases that quote unquote predispose African American boys to be marked off as ADHD,
So
which also has a negative effect.
So I do agree with what you're saying as far as that having and being a real thing.
Mhm.
But the thing is that again, there's a component to this where even if you have those things, those are actually part of the education as well. So you have things that you have to overcome in terms of you might have a teacher you don't like, but you lean on the socialization of, hey, maybe my classmate or maybe another adult or somebody I can talk to can get me through this situation. When it's just you and the computer and you don't like your teacher, what do?
Can you even learn to dislike your teacher in between the computer?
Exactly. So you're missing so much of everything that goes into education. It's like everyone's focusing on the meal, but nobody's acknowledging the ingredients that makes a meal. Mm-hmm. You need the nutmeg, the seasoned salt, the oregano, the chopped celery, the onion. All of these things are a component. You don't just come out with cuisine. You have all of these things that come together that give you what it is that you need. And education works the same way, regardless of who's failing to do their job and who's doing it exceptionally well. These are all parts of a process that you just do not get from a screen to person interaction and your parent.
No, makes sense. That makes sense. I just wanted to, and I like to, provide people with a space, voice in terms, especially when it's something specific to what it is they do in their everyday life. Because I like politics, but I'm also, even though we sit over top of everything, I'm not an educator. Uh, there are certain things that go into being an educator that I don't necessarily have the capacity to do. And even just in terms of, being fully transparent, like a struggle of having to be super, super patient with my son. Because now I see kind of how he was or how he might have been in class. Like he was probably the teacher's pet. Like my man get mad because he be having this little hand up and they don't call on him. My man, like, I know the answer. Why y'all keep calling on them? I ain't got time for this. And it will completely just like get up and be like, all right, cool, can I do this now? Because he feel like he get everything right and he be mad when the other kids get it wrong. It's like, bro.
That's me. Yeah. And that's how it was. That's how I got to where it was. It's like, me, I would read a book in class. Okay. But that's going back to this whole thing about socialization. But I think that's an off-camera joint that we can do, because that's a whole conversation. So I would ask you all, please, is what at the Gilded Sages?
Mm-hmm.
At the Gilded Sages on Instagram. DM us if you saw the link. Comment, what do you think is lost?
Call in too.
Yes, please do call in. But what do you think is lost in the socialization of schools being digital now and the digital divide? Because we got one more segment, don't we?
No, we good.
Okay. Then because what's really important is that we get the audience comment and see what's going on over there.
Okay, so
but hold on, before we go ahead and get to that, let me close out, and then we can go into just peer-to-peer engagement. But in terms of the conversation that we had today, in terms of bringing the information that we wanted to bring to you all, in terms of bringing our stances on the information that we have read, I want to thank you all for that, and I want to, while you're watching the video, if you can, hit a like button, please. If you can, share it. Sharing it is super awesome because it helps get the word out. It helps us have more of a conversation. It helps us become more robust. It helps us, do what it is we do, because to what he was talking about is having those conversations offline too, because we want to get to the point where we can have certain conversations on here, as I don't necessarily believe every conversation should be had offline, especially when it specifically pertains to the African American ADOS community, because certain narratives and certain things can be used against us, and we have to be careful of that. And I know everybody can say what they want and feel how they want, but please, let's be cognizant of that, and cognizant that we're using tools that are political and corporate tools as well, in terms of how they manage and how they move and how they shape markets. So again, thank y'all for that. Hit that like button, hit that share button. And so what we're going to do is we'll take not necessarily even an intermission. We still going to be here. We can chop it up. But please make sure you drop the link. It's in the actual calendar. Okay. The invites is in the calendar. You could drop the link on my Facebook, because it's up. It's already logged in. It's already plugged in. You could drop it on there. You could drop it on all of the social media accounts that I have in the folder.
Since that's been done, while that's been done, and because we kind of moved through that pretty well, I think we did. So, because I am in education like arenas, and I get what he's saying is that once you are behind the scenes and you see educators, I can spot an educator because we manage our temperament well. That's what I don't like about adults. Adults don't know how to manage their temperament well.
At all.
They're like, okay, I'm right. It's like, you're right, but I still have to execute this for you. And I don't like your attitude. So because I don't like your attitude and I'm an adult, let's play like we're not toddlers and we're not going to act. I'll make a fat baby. Sometimes make a fat CEO baby. But it's like, I'm just going to bullshit this because fuck you.
Is that from Baltimore?
It's just like, that's why it is. Because that's what it is. And it's when you really begin to understand that people don't care that you're an authority figure. People care that you give a shit with the authority that you have. And because they give a shit about the authority that you have that helps them go home and do what the hell they want to do, that's where leadership comes in. Leadership doesn't come in and my daddy owns a company, so I get to tell you what to do. And I do think that is also a stereotype of people who come from affluence and of people who come from rich backgrounds, because it's just like no one's born knowing how to be rich. You still have to learn it.
Yeah, it's a maintenance factor.
You gotta learn how to be rich. Huh?
I think it's a maintenance factor that doesn't get factored into the conversation, because maintenance isn't talked about enough. Like even when people talk about like Donald Trump or people being blessed, as much as I don't like people, comparing themselves to a Steve Jobs or a Jeff Bezos, in terms of being able to do certain things, or the other side of the argument is like, well, he would have did that if he had this, and it's like, understand though that that's what legacy is about.
Bill Gates talk about that now.
Bill Gates talks about it, but the thing is, we don't have people on our side to communicate that in a way, because
we're those people now.
Exactly, but the whole thing is everybody can't make every argument.
That's true.
So what has to happen is like, look, I understand y'all want to be the Bezos and the certain people, but understanding that lifestyle comes with certain things that a lot of people just don't. When I'm having a conversation with them, don't want to give to, because you have to submit to what the lifestyle is of a certain economic level, because it's not you just make the money one time. They're constantly things pulling at, they're constantly resources extracting from you as well as you're pulling. So it's not this thing of like people interact with it and engage with it like, I'm just gonna make this and be off and be good. It's like that's not how that works.
Man,
It's maintenance in that.
Waka Flocka talked about that in the Drink Champs interview. What you were saying?
Yeah, like you can't look at like gaining wealth as like a money grab or a bag or you just hit a lick. Like you have to be able to maintain. And that's why I say educating yourself as far as whatever it is that you want to do.
Yeah, but we also gotta get to a point of talking about market realities, right?
Yeah.
But because I don't want to ignore people and I see things over there. Is there anything that is of true interest in the comment section?
Pertaining to the
Anything, because we know I really would prefer people to call in. I would prefer if you call in because it allows for a much more robust conversation, and we don't have to use Quan, although we love Quan, to be the intermediary between the physical space. We can hear your lovely voices as well.
yes,
But I would love to also hear your voice via text.
yes, the link is in the chat. Definitely click on, call in. Love to hear from you. Okay, so we did get a comment from Zimba G. He says pros from digital learning, parents close to children, no traveling, cons, no social interaction, hard for parents to manage child, work and home, child stares at screen.
And then the screen time is also important because we also got to understand the emotional development of these kids. It's like some people who are in the business don't like screen time for people who are at a certain age because they become addicted to it and they get tied to it. So going back to what we were talking about, will we ever return? We have to return to traditional things. We are human. We are not machines.
Yes.
We have to grow into understanding ourselves than machines. I know there's a huge movement, especially with Elon sucks. Because I hate Elon Musk. He's stupid.
Elon sucks.
Elon sucks. That's his name. Elon sucks.
So simple but so good.
Elon sucks. Elon sucks always wants to pretend that it's easy to merge biology with technology because he can frame something in his imagination. It's just like, you sound stupid. Do you think neurologists don't understand how complicated the human brain is? There's so many things we still don't understand. So you want to introduce one sophisticated system to another sophisticated system and sell it to the masses. We have enough trouble with teams behind cars.
Yeah.
So what do you give a team that can control an electric motor power car, which has a lot higher torque, meaning it accelerates faster, and they can do what they can mind? You will give an undeveloped brain a chip? That is so stupid.
Yeah. But again, that's where you
Elon
get
sucks,
back
son.
to the conversation about the morality of the whole situation. Is everybody's thing is, and this is where I would say lower income, working poor people kind of fuck themselves over, because what happens is they advocate for it at the same time. Like the immoral nature of capital and how capital moves, they advocate for it in the sense of believing that either one day they'll be able to participate at that level, or the fact that, and I hate it, the whole it is what it is. Like, I understand it is what it is, but that doesn't make it a thing. Doesn't make it right. And we can argue about right and wrong, but at the same time, even if it's right, doesn't make it effective.
Then that's where we get to the whole market thing of, is this sustainable? Come on, bro. Is that so sustainable? Like, what is sustainable cotton? You gotta be sustainable. What is sustainable is listen to the goddamn earth. If the earth tells you it takes 6 months for me to goddamn heal, go like, yeah, this is expensive. Why? Because it takes 6 months to get it. And this is where the average consumer has to listen to the luxury market. The luxury market charges you on time. It charges you the time of the crafts person that put it together. Mm-hmm. It charges you on the time of the person who made it. It charges you time. It charges you time, but we all know in luxury as well that it's like every other hustler, they cut corners where they can and don't tell you where they cut corners. And most of the time, that's in labor markets. And that's why developing nations continue to be on the front of headlines. Sri Lanka is one of the great examples of having manufacturers manufacture their goods there, but don't pay market value when it comes down to the labor, or exploit that there's a huge talent pool of labor, but it's all mostly unskilled. But what I'm getting down to is that we don't talk about the sustainability of wealth or riches itself. I'm distinguishing riches as in material, wealth as in lifestyle. We are in a point in which we have extinct rebellion. I don't know if you saw the protest that they're having in the UK right now. I think it's a rebellion extinction. Please correct me if you are abroad and you know what I'm talking about. But what I'm talking about is that we're at a point now in which people are saying the environment itself is saying that you can't sustain it. Yeah, you're taking more. Not only are you draining people, but you're draining the environment more than you can replace it. So sustainability is literally accepting seasonal shit. It's like, no, we're not seasonal we're not farm to table because we're hipsters. We're farm to table because that's how life really the fuck is. It's like it's farm to table. Like you don't have the option. You kind of can't get this right now. So that means that people have to give up avocados all the goddamn time. I hate trendy foods. If you take me to a place and they have a trendy food item, I may unfriend you. I'm serious.
But I always talk about,
in life, I will unfriend you.
Lady Gaga coins it, we all little monsters. But I don't think people ever think about the fact that people cry continuously about politicians being corrupt and so on and so forth. And I'm always thinking like, I don't like these niggas, but at the same time, most people are insatiable, and the game is I'm about to give y'all what y'all want. So again, we could talk about certain things, but as long as the masses is insatiable, I don't see a lot of things changing because again, it doesn't shift the market. Shifting the market is more about what the collective masses is doing than the few people at the top. The top is responding, constantly responding. Do they dictate in a lot of ways? Absolutely. In ways to help them continue the same trajectory. But if people actively just said one day, like, you know what? No, I know that that's a thing, but I want to walk away from it. They would have no other recourse.
But that's when, for me, because we outside of the whole pretending, now we just kicking it. Capitalism to me is about the price, like literally your day-to-day price. Democracy in America is about a price point. And again, I always go back to this restaurant up on 11th Street. I'm not going to use the name because I don't want to be disparaging towards it. I love their fries. Don't hate on me, y'all. I know I'm on this journey to lose weight, but I always will be a fat ass. I came up with this. I'm so serious. I came up with this drink the other day. I want to have this called FFM. And I'm going to tell you what FFM means off the camera. I know what you guys may think it means, but that's not what it means.
Fat fucker man?
No. That's not what it means. But the whole thing is that this environment, and this is when intersectionality also fails. This is where white liberalism also fails. Is that you want things of a certain quality, but that price point excludes the people that you say that you want to include. So that's when diversity and inclusion goes to virtue signaling on one side of the spectrum, and on the other side of the spectrum, like, here go whitey again, saying that they're going to save us. What you going to do, give us the crust off your bread? And that's how people feel. Exactly. That's how people feel. So you going to give us the crust and say you gave us a meal?
Want this shit.
I don't want this. I want what you got. But anyway, you walk in there and everybody in the staff is a rainbow coalition. And I don't mean to use rainbow as in say LGBTQIA. I mean literally the light spectrum being diffused through time after the rain. You have the rainbow coalition. Everybody's there. But if you can't afford $15 as an advertiser, and you can't afford $30 or however, if you can't afford $45 as this is just lunch, you miss out on so many different conversations because you can't have a conversation about the food. That's the same thing when we talking about when we was talking about the shoes. Or when we were just now when we were talking about everything else. And especially when we talk about first grade. You don't give a damn about the lessons, you give a damn about your friends.
Yeah.
And peer-to-peer learning is really important.
In my opinion, the most important.
Bless you. What you mean by the most important? What you mean by the most important?
It's the most
Bless
important.
Man.
Because at the end of the day, that translates more to the workplace than the actual 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah, I would agree.
Peer-to-peer learning.
Yeah. Like you would want to be able to learn how to deal with your teacher who presents themselves as the boss.
Yes.
Learn the strategies of being able to get on the boss's good side.
I don't do that.
Learning how to talk your way through a conflict. Like there's a lot of different
Why
things.
don't we just fight, son? Square up.
Yeah, conflict resolution been missing. That's why a lot of the murders and stuff happen too.
People don't know how to de-escalate.
You learn that in school.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
some people learn how to escalate. Like Sison is the whole thing.
I mean, yeah, prayfully.
Sison is the whole thing.
Prayfully, you learn that through school.
Prayfully, your school doesn't have teachers that say, I got mine, you got to get yours.
I mean, yeah,
So you become like me. I hate school.
But you definitely don't get that through a screen.
Dude, my thing about this, I'm sorry, I'm just a petty person. At a certain point in time, we have gotten sensitive about how life really functions. It's like death has always been a reality in life. It's always been a reality. And now we're at a point in which we don't want to talk about death because it talks about our mortality. It's just like, yes, it's very important to talk about death because it's a part of maturing. It's a part of valuing and assessing risk. Mm-hmm. Is it necessary for you to do this thing? Is it necessary for us to forego talking about the health and sciences and public health for a military budget? What war are we preparing for? Or is the Defense Department just a cheap way to do research and development so that someone in Silicon Valley can use the internet or the defense salaries and defense innovation to actually make money off? It's like most of the people who make money or who built these things were not millionaires. They were just people who were working during the Cold War or trying to find an intranet system so that different departments communicate with each other. Then somebody, going back to Steve Jobs, came in and like, oh, that's great. We can use this. And just took the technology and ran with it. But we got to show what America sucks at, and I'll get off my soapbox, is sharing its prosperity and its innovations with the masses. It's such a, Puritan, you're poor, it's your fault, God like me, God bless me, fuck you, I want to keep my money for me, but I will exploit you if my company fails.
So what I'm gonna do right now is family. I want to thank y'all. Something just came over me. Like I don't know what's going on right now. But we gonna head out today. I want to thank y'all again for coming out to join us in the conversation. We appreciate it very much. Again, like the video, share the video. Those are the free things that you can do to help us out. Because again, we try to have the conversations. We trying to have events so that we can have a lot of these, conversations behind closed doors as well. And then being able to provide some things on the back end as a service and goods for everybody who participate in the Sage community. So again, thank you all. What we're going to do is we're going to chop this down. We're going to get this back to y'all. And we appreciate the people who was here with us in the live. Y'all enjoy the rest of y'all weekend. Enjoy Labor Day, the rest of y'all Labor Day weekend if you here in America with us. And just enjoy y'all family. Shout out to everybody who started school this week. Much love to y'all. Stay strong. I know it's hard. I'm out here struggling as well. But again, love y'all. Be safe. And we'll check y'all. We'll check in with y'all again next week. Thank you.